course, for an explain the importance question, any explain question, the exam board wants you to do a most important reason. And for this one, my most important, the biggest importance, should I say, of the Transcontinental Railroad opening was that it brought hundreds of thousands of homesteaders to the American West, accelerating the numbers of people moving there and the settlement of the West. But those that were already there, as well as those that arrived, the railroads solved a lot of the problems that the homesteaders had. Bringing barbed wire so they could fence things off, bringing building materials so they have to have the houses made out of sod or mud, and giving them something to transport their produce on to sell at market, among with many other things that I spoke about in the first podcast. Another reason why the first Transcontinental Railroad was so important has to do with the Native Americans. The railroads disrupted the buffalo herds. Also, not only did it disrupt the buffalo herds in terms of the location of them, there were people being paid to kill buffalo to feed the railway workers. It also brought gold miners who went onto sacred land, famously Black Hills of Dakota, starting the Great Sioux War. It just generally caused conflict with the Native Americans, and then when the Native Americans ever fought back, the railroads brought the army, which would then always defeat the Native Americans in the end. All of the things that I've just mentioned, they either eventually removed the natives from the land and opened the land to settlers, which is where all the conflict came from, really. So the opening of the railroad was massive for the defeat of the Native American destruction of their way of life. The most important thing linked to that winter was that the winter decimated the large herds on the open ranges. So after John Illiff first started it off, other people had copied him and set up huge ranches with thousands and thousands of cows. Now if you've got a really harsh winter, you can't put all those cows in a barn because there wouldn't be a barn big enough. And what they'd been concentrating on before the cattlemen had been quantity over quality of cow. But because of this, when this winter came and the cows had no shelter out on the open range, it killed so many cows that it sent many cattlemen bankrupt. And as you're about to see in the second paragraph, it led to a change in the cattle industry. But you've got to say the biggest impact was it killed hundreds of thousands of cows and bankrupted many cattlemen. Well, actually, having recorded the first paragraph, I've changed my mind. Actually, because of the long-term consequences, I think the most important was the changes that came afterwards. So that was a 1 year really, 2 year impact. But the long-term impact was that the cattle industry changed forever afterwards. It resulted in smaller ranches where they could actually put the cattle into barns if they needed to, into some sort of shelter. And this time the cattlemen focused on better quality cows, so they selectively bred the bulls with the cows to produce the best meat, and therefore they got their profit that way. So yes, it caused the death destruction, but it changed the cattle industry by ending the open range and making cattlemen concentrate on smaller ranches. So actually that would be, but you could argue either. It doesn't matter in history, does it? You can argue whatever most important you want, so long as you've got logic as to why you've chosen something as more important than the other. That's really important. Well, Dawes Act came towards the end when the Native Americans were just about defeated, and they were all pretty much on the reservations. And what it did, it meant that individual Native Americans could apply to the government to buy individual plots of land that would become theirs rather than the tribes. So one important aspect was individual Native Americans could be landowners in their own right and not be heavily dependent on the tribe, but could do things their own way themselves. So it gave some degree of further independence to Native Americans, or individual Native Americans. In theory, anyway. But most importantly is by doing that, it broke up tribal lands and allowed individuals to own plots of land, as we've said. Doing this meant they didn't need to go to their chiefs and speak to their to tribal councils to get permission for things, because they owned the land. And so what it did is it destroyed the power of the chiefs, but it also destroyed the tribal structures. It was massive for disrupting and destroying really everything that had been the structure of the Native American way of life. Well, it was really important, and it's important to point out what Manifest Destiny was. A journalist of the 1840s said it, that Americans had this God-given right, this manifest destiny to occupy all of America, and when it suited the government plans, because the government wanted to encourage migration, and it was really important because the government was happy for the phrase to spread, encouraged its use, but it's something that resonated with people. They listened to it, they thought, yeah, actually, I agree with that. So of course it did encourage people to migrate west, as it made it sound like some religious pilgrimage, if you like. Maybe it's something that you should do, not something that you can do if you want, but it adds to this idea. It helped to convince many people to make that move west. But here's one way I would be trying to be clever to the examiners, because I would say, well, Manifest Destiny was important for people moving west to an extent, but rather than it being a reason why people moved west, it was more of a justification for people who wanted to move west for other reasons. And I'd be questioning the question and saying, well, maybe it was more of a justification than a reason. So if people wanted to go to get gold, for example, they could say, well, this is just Manifest Destiny, and they were doing what was God's will anyway. So there we go. It gave people this justification that they can occupy all the land, fight and destroy the Native American way of life, and fight the Mexicans, and that was just fine because it was Manifest Destiny for them to do so. So yeah, hopefully that'd be something that would impress the... I'm sure it would be, because it's a clever idea to go, hold on a minute, it wasn't an important reason so much, it was an important justification. It's like questioning the question, a very A-star or grade 9 thing to do. Well, of course, it was absolutely crucial because people got 160 acres if they agreed to live there for 5 years. And actually it had its biggest impact after 1865, when the Civil War had ended, and there was you should have recognised that, 1865, why? Because the Civil War had ended, so there was a lot of unemployed people without many prospects who wanted to start afresh after the horrors of the Civil War. And so it was fantastic for them. They could just go and claim their own land, farm it, build their own house, and start a new life somewhere away from everything else that had already happened to them. It's safe to say that thousands upon thousands of people moved as a result of the 1862 Homestead Act. And well, the reason it was so important was because it led to further acts which increased the number of migrants, like the Southern Homestead Act, aimed at African Americans and white farmers who hadn't fought against the United States. Then the 1873 Timber and Culture Act, which gave another 160 acres if people agreed to have trees in it, and that's going to be important for the landscape of future settlers because they needed trees for wood as a resource. And the Desert Land Act, which would settle desert areas by giving people colossal amounts of land, as you can see there, 800 acres in total if the area was a bit harder to grow things on. So without the original Homestead Act, you couldn't have had all of these things, and each one of these extra acts brought more migrants to the plains. There you go. A word I'd be using here is streamlined, because before the cattlemen had to drive the cattle and get them on the railroads, somebody had to get over to the east to sell the cows, but this Abilene gave somewhere for the buyers from the east to meet the cowboys with the cows to buy the cowboy meet, and it just streamlined the whole process. It made it easier for this meeting of two sets of people who were geographically miles apart to meet in some sort of comfort where these deals could be struck. But none of that, could happen without Abilene being a really important, really well-resourced place for the cows to be. Nearly 4 million cattle passed through all the cow towns, and Abilene was the first one as well, by the way, so that's quite important because it inspired other cow towns. It had good grazing, good water resources, it was further west than other cattle trails, so it could avoid conflict with homesteaders, and the numbers that used it showed just how important Abilene was as a cow town. Well, the buffalo dictated their lives, and the Native Americans lived where the buffalo herds had moved to, so they decided where they lived based on the buffalo. And the teepees were designed because they were easily transported because of the buffalo herds, and young braves could get honour and prestige from their skill in hunting. So the buffalo was just crucial to so many aspects of Native American life. And you could go through all of the things that the buffalo's carcasses were used for once they'd been killed. Well, not always in fact, but their bladder of course they had to be dead for, the fur as well. The dung though, they could be alive for, so they could follow the herds around. They used the dung for fuel because there's not really many trees out on the plains to cut down and use for fire, as we know with the homesteaders. Who's made to make glue when they were boiled down, tongue as a hairbrush or eaten raw as a delicacy, and so many more things which your revision guides and your notes should tell you about, or any quick look on Google or even on BBC Bite Size will tell you. There's so many different uses of a buffalo, but I think many students would focus on the uses of the buffalo body rather than the fact that it governed the things that I've already talked about in the first paragraph. Well, of course, limited warfare wasn't working, so total warfare switch was huge. They tried to make treaties with the Indians, but it wasn't working because the chiefs didn't have any authority to stop individual braves from doing things. Every single treaty that had been made was broken either by the Indians or more likely by people like gold miners, who either didn't know or didn't care about the treaties, and the government did very little to try to stop them because, well, they didn't want to. They gained from gold being discovered and mined and so on and so forth. And you can give examples like Red Cloud's War or the Great Sioux War. So for whatever reason, limited warfare was not working, and therefore total warfare was crucial for the defeat of the Native Americans. And this is why it was so crucial, because the army, once they'd switched to total warfare and anything went, they had Gatling guns, which were like early machine guns, overwhelming numbers compared to the Indians, accurate long-range rifles. The Cheyenne War had ended because of a long-range, basically sniper, had hit a brave on his horse from a mile away, and the Indians had gone, what's the point, and given up. When total war came, the US Army had plenty of these long-range rifles, Gatling guns, and many, many very experienced, battle-hardened soldiers to wipe the floor with the Indians, who didn't usually fight wars like the American Army was used to. They were used to fighting little skirmishes and counting coup where they tried not to kill as a focus. So they just were totally unprepared for total warfare once it came, after the Battle of Little Bighorn, of course. And the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, because not long after the American Army switched to total warfare came the total defeat of the Native Americans and the end of their life as they knew it on the plains. Whereas there were decades of not total warfare where that just wasn't happening. I should first explain about the warrior society itself. That's talking about the warriors as a group, as their own society, but also the fact that Native American society was a warrior society. Now, the whole of their society was based on bravery and honour. And bravery and honour ruled how they lived. And their status in a tribe, like a chief, would be seen as incredibly honourable and been in hunting or battle. The counting coup, of course, where they didn't try to kill but they tried to touch their enemy and get away without being harmed themselves. Well, that was all for the sake of honour. Law and order didn't have really rules because they behaved because of the concept of honour and the embarrassment of shame. Old people being left to die by the tribe, they said, leave us now, we cannot contribute to this tribe. That's also linked to the warrior society because it's so linked to honour of them going, well, I can't contribute anymore, leave me here. So the warrior society was crucial for how they lived. The warriors themselves, well, they were crucial for hunting. The buffalo were crucial for life. They really needed hunts to go well, or the tribe would starve. And the warriors were expected to protect the women and the children and supply them with food. They were the ones who decided where to set camp, and they were the ones who guarded camp. So the warrior society, in terms of their beliefs and their values, was really important, but also what the warriors did in that society was really crucial, and they'd be my two paragraphs. Just as the warrior society was important, so too was religion. They believed in Wakantanka, the great spirit in the sky, and they believed that all things had a spirit. And this led to the Indians putting a lot of value in visions, which actually hindered them because they really believed in these visions, when to us what they would be seen as was hallucinations. So the sun dance, they would dance around poles for hours in the sun without eating or drinking until they hallucinated. Sweat lodges, same, not eating or drinking, fasting basically, staying somewhere hot and sweaty in a tent till they hallucinated, and so on and so forth. All these things was to try to receive visions from the spirits, which would then influence the decisions that they took, which is obviously not a good way to make decisions. For example, if you had a general in charge of your army, you wouldn't want that general to be drug-addled and trying to, because they smoke peace pipes, smoke funny herbs, you wouldn't want them to be hallucinating and basing their decisions on hallucinations and their strategies. So it was detrimental to them in many ways. Of course, it affected their influence towards the warfare that they got stuck in with the Americans anyway, because they didn't think anybody could own land, because everything comes from the land and goes back to it when dead. So really, the land owns everything. So how could you own the land? And also because higher up land was closer to Wakantanka, so therefore more sacred, when gold miners appeared on the Black Hills of Dakota, they were not going to stand for that, and they went on the warpath. So the religion affected their attitudes toward land and therefore warfare. Again, very important. Native Americans could live nomadic lives, which means moving from place to place, hunting and following the buffalo, because they had horses. Also, the fact that they lived these nomadic lives because they had horses links to their idea about land, because they never stayed in one place, so it didn't occur to them to try to own land. And this would then cause trouble when Americans moved west. So the fact that they owned horses, it actually changed Native Americans' way of life from before. They weren't nomadic, many of the tribes before, but horses gave them the means to follow this new lifestyle, which later on would lead to problems when Americans came along claiming land. So there we go. When the Native American tribes first got hold of horses, of course they'd be crucial for transport first and foremost, but one of the ways of warfare, one of the main aims in warfare, became to steal horses, and that would be shameful if you lost a horse, but also very honourable if you managed to steal one. Of course that causes conflict later on, because to a Native American it's honourable to manage to be clever enough to steal someone's horse. To an American settler, they'd be furious that someone had nicked their horse, and that was a crime. So there's a big clash of cultures there. Status and prestige for a long time for Native Americans was measured by how many horses an individual owned. Well, this is a terrible question if you don't know what it is, but the Indian Appropriations Act was the first attempt for the government to try to move Indians onto reservations, and what they put in the lot was to try to protect them. and try to civilise them. It was the start of the reservation policy, and what the government failed to recognise is that Indians didn't want to be forced onto the reservations, they didn't want to be protected, and they didn't want to be what the Americans called civilised, which is a really arrogant way of looking at it because the Indians had their own civilisation, which they were perfectly happy with at the time. But it was the start of this, well, it was really, you could call it the beginning of the end for the Native Americans. And it was the first government step on this path. And another reason, maybe the main reason in this case, was putting Indians on reservations, or trying to put them anyway, led to war. Practically every Indian war you can think of, and I hope you've revised a few of them, features a reservation invaded by miners or an attempt to put Indians on some reservations. You just basically name an Indian war that you know of, it will involve a reservation some way, somehow. So there we go. This Indian Appropriations Act, where it started, put the Indians on the reservations, and it led to conflict later down the line. Brigham Young, the Mormon leader. The most important reason why he was so important, the importance of his leadership, was that he managed to get the people to listen to him and do what he said and obey him without question. And linked to that, equally important, is the fact that he made some excellent decisions. So he was able to inspire loyalty and come up with clever ideas, like dividing arriving settlers up so that new settlements that he sent them to around the Great Salt Lake had the skills, the people with the skills that complemented each other, so those settlements would survive and maybe even thrive. Or he came up with the idea of strict times for drawing water from the irrigation ditches, because it had to come by water around the Great Salt Lake. And it worked, because people listened to him without question, and these decisions were very good ones. So that's why he was crucial to the settlement of the Great Salt Lake, and that's why that's most important. Although all that stuff was the most important, it must be noted that without Brigham Young, perhaps the settlers wouldn't have made it to the Great Salt Lake in the first place, because he chose the route and the location, and both the route to the Great Salt Lake and the Great Salt Lake settlement itself was miles away from other settlements or travellers. This is because the Mormons were always persecuted against, and this meant that if they kept away from other people, they could live in peace. And thousands came afterwards on the same trail that Brigham Young himself scouted. He was the head of that scouting, but he didn't leave it to others, he didn't delegate, he made sure he found it himself. So yeah. And of course, when the Mormons first arrived around the Great Salt Lake, it was Brigham Young who said, "This is the place." People looked at him like, "Here? What? Around this salty lake? It'll be easy for growing things, Brigham." He's like, "No, this is the place." And you know, he was proven right, because the settlement, which was to become Utah, the state that was to become Utah, it was incredibly successful and wealthy, and it still is to this day. You see, it'd be a temptation to read this question as, why were they useful for improving law and order? It's not that question, it's saying, how important was it for government effort to bring law and order? And most importantly, the springing up of mining settlements made it extremely difficult for the government to bring law and order to the west, because these towns sprang up quickly and became ghost towns just as quickly when the gold ran out, or whatever it was they were mining. There's you go on YouTube, Google, anywhere, you'll find loads of American ghost towns out in the middle of nowhere. And because they're in the middle of nowhere and they spring up quickly and they go away quickly, miles away from existing law and order, it was very difficult to keep up, basically, from the government to keep up with and to govern these places so that they had effective law and order. So it made it very difficult for the government. A further reason why it was very difficult is because of the amount of wealth on offer, and there was therefore claim jumping, where one fella said, "No, this is mine," and another guy came along and said, "No, I saw it first," and fights. Also, well, here we go, most miners were young single men, usually with guns, many of them ex-Civil War veterans. Oh no, it was a big problem. Young men, hot-headed, wealth, guns. Big mistake. Well, I say big mistake, a big problem. All in all, the mining towns made it more difficult for the government to bring law and order to the West rather than easier, and that's why they were so important, because it hindered the government's attempts. We've talked about Abilene in another question, and what you really had to work out here was that Joseph McCoy was the person who founded Abilene. And as we've talked about here, he allowed the whole process of the cattle industry to be streamlined, to work more efficiently / quickly. It was a clever location, good grazing, it's all we've talked about in a previous question. You could basically use the same points as I gave in the question about Abilene, but maybe for a bit of variety here, my second paragraph could be that Joseph McCoy, by setting up Abilene, he inspired other cow towns to be developed, like Dodge City, my favourite named city, or Cheyenne, named after the tribe, because it was in the area the tribe had lived their lives peacefully before. And this is really important because of that statistic that between 1867 and 1885 nearly 4 million cattle went through cow towns. Maybe without Joseph McCoy setting up that first one at Abilene, that might not have happened. And those numbers speak for themselves. That's why he was so important. Well, I'd divide this question a little bit differently, and I would say my line of reasoning would be that, and that's what you've really got to do, have a line of reasoning in these questions. My line of reasoning would be that cowboys were incredibly important at first and less important as time wore on. Crucial to begin with because of the long cattle drives. There were a lot of unemployment in the South after the Civil War who'd worked for cheap. It helped cattle owners to make a lot of money because they could find lots of men who were willing to work very little, and that would keep costs down. These men were willing to brave all the dangers of the cattle drives, and without loads of cowboys to oversee these cattle drives, they couldn't have happened, and so much money couldn't have been made. So they were crucial to begin with. Of course, as time wore on, they were less crucial. But they were still important. When it came after John Iliffe set up the first ranch, and many people copied him, on the ranches they were really important because the ranches were big open plain ranches, so they had to walk the line, which is walk the outside of the ranch land, to protect the herd from predators, from rustlers coming to steal cattle, looking out for sick cattle, finding them, trying to help. And then of course after the winter of 1886-7, on the smaller ranches, they were still necessary, basically cow farmers at that point, a lot less important. So as the different stages, as it went from the cattle drives to the open, massive ranches to the smaller ranches, as that time wore on, cowboys became less important. But at no point were they not important. They were always, of course, important in one way or another.